Dawn held its breath over a sea that did not trust men. In the hour when the dark is loosest in its moorings and the light is a rumor, the water around the little boat showed a skin like hammered pewter, bruised and slick, dimpled by the wind that came cold from the teeth of the world. The oars creaked. Davos Seaworth kept them low and steady so as not to slap, not to speak too loudly the fact of his coming. His breath steamed and went to nothing. Above, the sky had the color of old vellum that had been left near a hearth too long, smoke-stained and thin along the edges where the sun would try its knife. He smelled kelp and old ice, and that rank sweetness that comes when whales pass deep under. Skagos crouched ahead of him like the back of some great thing risen to think upon its sins, its cliffs a line of black, its beaches braided with white and gray where the surf combed through stones like a miser's fingers through coin. They said there were unicorns here and cannibals, and men who were so proud of their hunger they went to sleep with knives under their tongues. They said many things about this island, and many of those things were lies told by sailors to make their voices worth more than the ale they drank with them. Davos did not trouble himself with the truth or the falsity of any of it. Land was land, and men were men, and the work would be the same either way. He pulled once more, then once more again, each stroke a careful prayer to the oars, and the boat slid into the lee of a shelving cove where an old cave mouth watched him like a blind eye. There was a chain of kelp here, ropes of it, thick as a man's thigh, and he feathered the oar to part it and not foul his blade. The keel kissed stones. He rose, and his knees complained of the hours behind him, but he was used to complaints and to aches, and to the small treasons a body commits upon its master when weather and work have become unfriendly. He drew the boat up by the painter, looped it to a horn of rock, and stood to let the land tell him what it would. Wind, heavier now that the cliffs broke it into meaner, sharper thoughts. A slink of drift snow along the pebbles. The smell of seal fat burned long ago, which was an old smell and somehow new again on each breath. A gull made the sound of a hinge. At the edge of hearing there was a clack and a clatter, stone on stone, too regular for the sea's work. "You've a long way and an empty belly to come stealing fish," said a voice he could not see. It came from beyond the slanted shoulder of the cove and carried that straight, north sound that turned every word into iron. "I'm too old to trouble fish," Davos said, "and too hungry to trouble men unless they trouble me. I came to trouble your hall, if it likes men who bring news." The man who stepped out wore sealskin stitched with fiber that looked like sinew and might as well have been iron for how it sat upon him. He had a beard like a drift of dirty snow and hair that had never met a comb with even temper. He carried a spear with a head that was not from the iron of any forge Davos knew. It was black, it was glass, it was the sort of thing the world made when it was angry. Obsidian, old as the blood it remembered. "You talk like a crow," the man said. "News is a crow's excuse for meat." He looked at Davos's hands, at the boat, at the scars on the knuckles that old ropes had given like little marriages one never remembered consenting to. His eyes found the pouch that hung from the captain's neck. Davos's fingers rose to it as they always did, seeking old bones, finding only the skin and the thread and the habit. "What is your name, crow who has no wings?" "Davos." A smuggler turned knight turned thinner man than he was. "I seek the hall at King's House," he said. "I seek a boy. Many men do. Boys become reasons for wars when they belong to great houses," the Skagosi said. He did not smile, which meant he had smiled once in his life and did not wish to spend his second smile on this. "Come. Your news can be stripped here or inside. The wind prefers the skin." Inside was a path that had not so much been cut from rock as convinced to move aside a little. The way rose narrow, with ice set into it like mirrors that did not care to show men their faces. Davos found a rhythm in the climb, the old man's rhythm that takes the breath as a bargain instead of a right. The Skagosi walked as if the path belonged to him not only today but yesterday and tomorrow too. When they came to a ledge that looked east, the sea was a sheet of gray metal all the way to a place where the world bent, and something moved below them. Shaggy, heavy, with a single horn that made the air seem thinner around it as if it drank the sky. The animal flicked an ear the size of a child's cloak. "Unicorn," Davos said without meaning to. Unicorn, the man agreed, as if to name it was to admit nothing. You'll not be eating it. I've no wish to, Davos said. I came for a Stark. The man looked at him sideways. You came far, then, he said, and the words held no kindness, but they held a fact, and facts were kinder than most things. King's house did not look like a place that needed to be asked permission for anything. It was set into the rock in terraces like a bleached jaw with too many teeth, and the skin of it was laid with stones the color of old anchors. Smoke came from vents cut like gills. There were men at the door with axes whose heads were buried in leather to keep them from biting the wrong thing on a cold morning. The air tasted of whale oil and the old, flat fat of seals. The Skagosi bade Davos stop and say nothing as he went in to speak with his lord. Davos waited. He could hear the sound of low speech, then higher, then laughing that was not laughter but the throat doing its duty to a custom. When they called him, he went, and he put his hand out of habit to the pouch at his neck and felt nothing where once his finger bones had given him courage. They were gone into the Blackwater with so much else. Sons, king, the boast of better men than he. He thought of Dale for a heartbeat, of the way his eldest had smiled like he never expected to be repaid for any kindness. Then he thought of what he had come for, and put his mind to work as a sailor puts his heel to the thwart to keep the boat from staggering. The hull was a long belly of stone with ribs of wood blackened by years of breath and smoke. Light came from bowls of oil set upon tripods, and from a hole in the roof where the anger of the fire could go up and the arguments of men could go out to the air that would not take sides. At the far end, on a seat that had the dignity of having been useful once and the arrogance of pretending still to be, sat a man bigger than a small horse, with hands that looked like he could close them around a man's head and not find his fingers meeting. His hair was a gray that remembered blue. His eyes were the color of rocks near tidewater, the kind that had seen too many cold waves and now preferred their own company. The man from the green lands, he said, when Davos had crossed to the place where a stranger could stand and not insult his host. Speak as if the wind were carrying you. Say nothing you cannot eat later. Davos bowed, but not too much. My Lord Magner, he said, Wyman Manderley of White Harbor sends respect. He sends me. There is a boy of 5 years. He would be older now. Brown hair, gray eyes, face like a wolf pup who hasn't learned he's a wolf. He came here in bad season with a woman who carries a spear better than some men carry food. Their names are Rickon, Stark, and Osha. If the tales that walked on the decks of honest ships are not liars, they are in your keeping. The hall took a breath for him. Men shifted. Someone coughed in that theatrical way that announces the cough is here to keep swords from being drawn. The Lord's mouth did not move for a long while, as if he weighed a winter in one cheek and a spring in the other and did not much like the taste of either. Then he rumbled. You bring a fat man's respect to a hard island. You bring names with it and a hunger behind the names. It is true that a boy came here with a wolf so black the light avoided it, and a woman whose hands do not tremble. It is also true that men from the Greenlands, fat men, thin men, men who believe the sea owes them a debt, have given my island only trouble all the seasons I remember. No debt is owed to me, Davos said, nor to Lord Wyman, though he would argue it differently, being who he is. It is owed to the boy. His father died in a city that forgot what vows were made for, and his brother was butchered at a feast where guest right lay on the boards like spilled ale. The Dreadfort wears Winterfell's skin, my lord. Bolton calls it his. Freys strut in cloaks they stitched from the backs of buried men. Every Northman with a memory wakes at night and tastes ash and betrayal and thinks he must have dreamed it. He did not. The boy you shelter is their truth. He is a Stark of Winterfell, and men will rise for the truth of him. One of the men along the wall snorted. Men will rise for food when their bellies are too empty to lie flat, he said. Men will rise for a purse and for another man's wife. Men will rise with swords when the man at their back has a spear. They will, Davos agreed. He did not look at the man, did not give the back of the hall his attention when the front demanded it. But where the North is concerned, they will rise for a boy with a direwolf if that boy has a name that fits the land in their mouths. I have sailed all the coasts the narrow sea cares to boast. I have known what men die for. Names are one such thing. The Magner leaned forward until the wooden throne muttered its grievances under him. You speak like a man who has lost more than he expected to, he said. What does the fat lord intend, if I loose the boy to your keeping? He intends a harbor full of ships under his merman's tongue and ovens that do more than make pretty crusts, Davos said. He intends to call banners, quiet at first, quiet like snow falling, not like a drum. He intends to send men west to Bear Island and north to the mountain clans, and east to Flint's men and Serwyn's men, and he intends to do it before the Boltons know they've been bled. You have the face of a liar who hates lying, the Magner said. He sat back, his hand opened like a trap. Bring them. They came from a side door, Osha first, with the easy, heavy grace of a spear balanced in calloused fingers, and the boy with her, his hair a tangle that had forgotten combs exist, his feet in boots that had been made by someone who understood boots from the ground up. There are children who have learned to make themselves small out of courtesy to rooms that are too big for them. Rickon Stark did not possess that trick. He walked as if the floor were a forest he trusted, as if his feet and the stone had a conversation so old and quiet no one else could hear it. The wolf with him was a dark that ate light. It moved like a thought, tail a question, eyes green enough to grow things. Shaggy Dog, Davos thought and stood very still. Who are you? The boy asked. His voice had none of his father's quiet music nor his brother's care. It had a north stone in it and a child's willingness to throw the stone just to see the splash. Davos Seaworth, he answered. I knew your father. I saw the king your brother served. I ate salt on ships and bread on rocks that would not give me a name. I came a long way to say you are needed. Osha's eyes divided him up as if she would keep the larger share. Needed by who? She asked. By fat men and their oaths? By crows in black who forget which side of the wall their feet stand on? Needed by lies? By men who go to their meat in silence when the wrong banners fly over their fathers' keeps? Davos said. Lady Osha, I'll not dress it for your liking. The world will try to eat this boy, but where I come from the men have begun to starve on their knees. The wolf came close enough that Davos could smell the rank, clean animal smell that had nothing of kennels in it. Its head rose to his hand as if to say there were answers in that hand, and then it did not touch him. Rickon had not moved his feet. He picked at the bone ring on one of his fingers, carved crudely but with love by someone with more time than skill. The boy stared. You smell like salt, he said. I am salt, Davos said, and was surprised at the truth of it in his mouth. The Magner's laughter came up from all the way down inside him. This salt man wants to steal you from our island, he told the boy. He says wolves run better on the snow that belongs to the Dreadfort than on this honest rock. I say wolves run for Winterfell and men run for wolves, Davos said, and then he made himself quiet because a smuggler knows when one more good word is a word too many. The quiet unspooled. Osha's mouth had gone tight with a mother's thinking. She had the look of a hill cat who has brought down meat and knows there is a shadow bigger than hers watching. If I tell you yes, she said to Davos at last, and the sea throws you into its mouth, what then? Then I will have drowned working in the right direction, Davos said, and felt the absurdity of it. I can make the run in a boat that rides low and gives the wind nothing to get its teeth around. The bite is watched. Dog's head is watched. But there are seams along any coat if a man has patience to find them. And there are friends to be made among men who fish at night and grumble in the morning. You talk like a man who has sailed more than he has slept, the Magner said. Very well. We are not keepers of another man's sons. We were not asked to be. The boy came to us from snows that tried to be wolves in his ribs. We kept him from biting his tongue on dreams. We taught him to make a hook that finds fish even when fish wish it otherwise. He goes now if he goes with a promise. Name it, Davos said. When the boy is a man, when men have stopped asking if he has hair on his face and started asking if he has a sword in his hand, he will remember Skagos, the Magner said. He will remember that we ate salt with him and did not eat him. And when banners are counted the way sheep are counted with stones in pockets, one of those stones will stand for the houses of this island. He will remember, Davos said. I will remember. You have my word, and the merman's word, and if the boy is given a chance to have his own word, he will give it too. Rickon had come closer without moving his feet so far as Davos could tell. Sometimes wolves taught boys to do that, and sometimes boys taught wolves. I don't want to be eaten by the sea, he said. No one does, Davos said. It is a poor host, but I am a better guest than it is a host. The boy looked up at Osha. She had a private look she used for him, a look that had no spear in it and no island in it and no man in it but him. She put her hand on the back of his head. We go, she said, and it had the taste of a blade that has decided a thing. We go quick before the world changes its mind. They did not go quick in the way men mean when they say quick. The Magner gave them meat that remembered smoke and bread that remembered hands and skins that remembered the warmth of animal bodies before they remembered anything else. He gave them a boat that had no words written upon it and no colors to tell tales later. He gave them 2 men with shoulders like doors, brothers, by the shrug of their bodies near each other, who did not speak and who did not need to. Stain, he said of one. Crowl, he said of the other, and the names went into Davos like nails. There were seals on a spit that turned slowly to itself. There were women sewing, old women with fingers that had more skill than patience. The unicorn stood on a slope like thoughts in the mind of a god that had forgotten to open its mouth. The world of land gave them to the world of sea at a tide that carried muck and story both. The first mile stank of rotting weed and the old, cold death that always lives in shallow pools. The second mile was a line where the stink ran out of breath. The third mile was gray water and honest wind that had not been trapped against the land. And then there was nothing for a while but work. Davos showed them what his hands knew. He made the small sail a shy thing, a modest thing, a thing that did not beg for more than its portion. He kept their wake tight. He spoke to the boat in the language of men who know that wood will listen if asked in the right way. The Stain brother bailed in a rhythm the sea had not the wit to break. The Crowl brother watched the north as if it owed him something and would try to forget. Osha crouched with her spear across her knees, eyes on the boy, mouth a hard line. The direwolf made no sound at all. When it breathed, Davos could feel the boat inch to that breath or away. The weather remembered something unkind around midday. It came on like a woman who has decided the time for courtesy is over. The wind turned its head and blew from a mouth that tasted of ice. The waves found their shoulders. Water leapt aboard like thieves. The boat was a man running downhill with an armful of knives. Davos set the tiller against his hip and locked his mind around 3 things. The way the bow must never fall off the wind for more than a heartbeat. The way to lift his shoulder into the next slap without giving his weight too soon. And the small sounds a child makes when he is pretending he is not afraid. He told the boy a story because a smuggler knows stories are oars when hands are too small. There was a prince of Lys who wanted a ship that could not sink, he said, the words chopped by the taste of salt. He paid 3 shipwrights 3 piles of gold, and 2 of them made him the finest ship the narrow sea ever saw. The third made him a small boat with a bad temper and said, "This will not sink because it is too stubborn to drown." The prince chose the fine ship. It sank the first time the sea thought about it. The small boat he gave to a man with ugly hands. The boat sailed 100 storms and came back lean and smiling. Rickon's eyes were on him as if the story were the rope that held the world together. What was the boat's name? He asked, over wind, over water, hair slicked to his head like wet crow feathers. Luck, Davos said, and to his own surprise the saying of it made heat in his chest. They hunted Lee where they could find it. They took it where they could not. A mile before dusk the wind changed its mind again, and the sea gave them its shoulder instead of its fist. The bite was a trap that bit slowly, and Dog's head was a tongue that licked ships into the teeth of men who watched for them. Davos threaded seams. He put their smallness to work like a virtue. Few men look for prey that rides this low, wears this little. He took them farther east than a drunk man would advise and farther west than a careful man would bless. And then, in a dragging dusk that had more purple in it than he liked to see, the watchfires of the outer shoals near White Harbor showed themselves like old coins rubbed thin. They stood off until the tide did what he asked without arguing. And then they went to ground in a mud that had known ships since before men knew themselves. The harbor swallowed the night around them, and then the city was a quiet voice. White Harbor, with its houses stacked like loaves, its lamps strung along the curve of the Mander like stars that refused to stay in the sky, its walls that looked carved from fat and salt. The merman's court hunched like a beast that had eaten too well. Davos swallowed and found his throat dry. He had made a promise to a man who had fed him treachery and loyalty in the same pie. He had made it on behalf of a boy who did not own a single thing in the world but his name. "Keep the wolf close," he told Osha. "Men will want to prove they fear nothing. Men are fools." Her mouth flicked. "You only learn that now?" she asked, and the first ghost of something like mirth passed across her face, and then it was gone like breath on a window in winter. They did not go to the great gatehouse to cry their worth. They slid instead along the cut of the river where the netmakers set their benches, past the lofts where sailcloth slept like rolled-up weather, and came to a pier where the barnacles had done the tallying of the city's years because the city would not bother. A man stood waiting whose belly had its own politics, whose jowls had learned patience without losing appetite. His rings flashed with their own greed. He was dressed like a banker, and a sea lord had fought to a draw for the right to clothe him that morning. He leaned upon a staff carved into the shape of a serpent swallowing its tail. "Ser Davos," Wyman Manderley said, making the title a kindness and an accusation both. "There is a smell upon you of storm, and of hope. I am a fat man. I am not a fool. If you have brought me what I asked for, I will be both thinner and happier. This would not be good for my enemies." Davos stepped aside. The boy leaped up onto the pier as if the water were a thing that might try to grab him by the ankles, and he had no intention of being polite to it. Shaggy Dog came after, a shadow over a shadow. Osha stood with the spear as if to suggest anyone who approached without asking would teach everyone present a thing they did not wish to learn. Wyman Manderley's face did a number of things in the space of 2 heartbeats. It arranged itself. The man's eyes were wet above cheeks that had refused to be thin out of principle. He made a sound that might have been a swallow and might have been a prayer. Then that fat man who had taught courtiers how to bow and not lose their balance did a careful, gradual thing like a city sinking. He went to his knees. "Your lordship," he said. His voice had grown very large and very soft at once. It filled the cold air the way stew fills a poor man.
Winterfell sont.
"Welcome to White Harbor. I am Wyman of House Manderley. My house fed and guarded the kings of winter when some of the men who pretend to rule you now were nothing but damp ideas in the far south. If it please you, I will be your servant until my bones agree to be dust." The boy looked unsure of where to put his hands. He reached out and touched the man's hair. It was not courtly. It was not anything. It was a child trying to see if a thing was real. Shaggy Dog made a noise that was half snort and half thought. Wyman laughed. There was water in it. He rose. "We will go in by the kitchen door," he said then, business rushing in after feeling like the tide behind a good wind. "We will go in like we have been going in all our lives. Men whose tongues wag under other men's banners will not see what they cannot. There are frays who drink my wine and pick at my meat as if I fattened myself to feed their knives. I smile at them with all the teeth I have left. I would like to keep those teeth another day. Come." In the shadow of the walls, White Harbor smelt like yeast and fish and the tallow of too many candles and the river that had been invited to stay and had accepted. They moved like a family. The fat man with his staff that told stories even when he did not. The smuggler who had learned how to make himself part of a place where he did not belong. The wildling woman who had discovered she could put her back to a lord and not be struck from behind. The boy who walked as if wolves had taught him manners, and the wolf who kept the world 2 heartbeats away. They slid through doors that were no more than planks with pride, through rooms where people wore weariness like a second shirt, through passages that had been made by servants and for servants and which had forgotten the language of trumpets. They came into a room that had too much warmth in it for Davos at first, because men who have been too long in weather learn to mistrust heat that does not require paying for it with blood or sweat. There were pots and pans and the smell of onions doing their slow alchemy. There were girls with flour in their hair. There were spits with haunches of something polite enough not to be named in front of a wolf. Wyman manderly dismissed everyone with emotion like a lazy wave that had learned diplomacy. He turned, and in the privacy of steam and fat, he let himself look again and did not make a courtier's face. "By all the drowned gods of all the drowned sailors I never paid," he said. "A Stark in my kitchen. The world remains capable of jokes." Rickon's cheeks were red from cold and eyes from not blinking when he wanted. He stood with his fists near his pockets like any boy invited into a room where food lived. Davos waited for the moment to fold into itself, for the point at which it would become something else. An oath, a plan, a fear shaped like a man, because that point always came if he kept his mouth shut. "Ser Davos," Wyman said, filling the name with gratitude too heavy for courtesy. "You will eat. After, you will carry words for me to men who have forgotten how to listen. They will remember again in the company of a boy and his wolf. Osha of the gift, you will have guards who know that the use of their bodies is to take a blade and not to find a bed. Lordling, you will have a chamber where the walls are old enough to keep their own counsel, and a maester with a beard so long it could be braided into the hair of a unicorn. We will not parade you. We will not whisper you. We will breathe you, and the city will take that breath and make of it the quietest storm in the north." "Do I get a sword?" Rickon asked. "You will have 3, Wyman said at once. "One for your hand, one for your name, and one for the fool who thinks those are different." "Keep him to a wooden one," Osha said. "Steel teaches bad lessons too quick." She leaned her spear against a rack of ladles. "If you fat men let this go sideways, I take him back to the rocks and the wolves. The boy will not be a banner while men grow fat on the sight of him." The fat lord did not bridle. He had bridled so often and so privately for so long that his neck had learned to stretch without showing it. He bowed to her as he would to a high-born lady who had forgotten her courtesy in favor of speaking truth. "Take my life if the first step goes wrong," he said. "I fed your boy this welcome with a kitchen rather than a hall because the hall has too many ears and not enough eyes. I will cook my enemies in the hall when it's time. In the kitchen, I will cook cleverness." The first birds went out that same hour. Not the high birds with bright ribbon ties whose flights say to every watchman's eye there is something to watch. Not the common run of ravens from Maester Theomore's rookery whose presence invites speculation. These were pigeons that nobody saw. These were gulls that were too proud to be caught. Men are deceived by their own idea of what matters. Wyman Manderly's messages moved the way a shadow does on a wall when a bee crawls across a candle. They went north first to the Finger of Flint, to Serwyn's broken skull of a keep where the daughter did sums at night with a knife to hand because numbers are no more honest than men. They went west, across the green-black ribs of the Wolfswood, to the huts where the mountain clans kept their honor like coals in the ashes of old fires. They went out along the stones of the stony shore where men who hardly spoke felt their throats itch with the old words. Winterfell, direwolf, king's blood. Ravens followed later, wrapped in the obviousness of duty. Each feather a sigh the city let go to keep itself from bursting. Davos went with the second hour, with a slice of pie that had fish and onion and the taste of a man's cunning baked into it, with a pouch at his belt that held not bones but letters that would make bones into men again if men remembered their own shape. Wyman Manderly put his hand on Davos's shoulder as a shipmate might, not as a lord would. "There are names you must learn to say with your eyes as well as your mouth," he said. "Alisane Mormont, to begin, Galbart Glover the absent, and Robert Glover who has returned from ironborn chains with wrists that itch. Old Wool and Big Bucket Wool, and the Norreis and Littles who would rather marry a bear than a man from south of the Shivering Sea. You will go to them and tell them the North remembers. Do not embroider the tale. Do not promise a thing you cannot hand to them in a bag. They will smell a lie through the smoke of 10 hearths." "I have no lies to sell," Davos said, and it was almost true. "You have hope," Wyman said and smiled sadly. "Hope is a lie that sometimes remembers how to be true. Go sell them that." They set out before midnight into a night that remembered winter too well to trust what the calendar said. The poultice of snow in the alleyways had been churned into a paste of gray. The river swung black where it went under the arches and then out to the sea to carry stories to men who would retell them in their own tongues. Osha had not left the boy's side. She had slept there on the floor between him and the door with the spear by her hand, and she had breathed like a person who had learned to make even breath a weapon. The dire wolf had done as wolves do, stood sentinel in his sleep. When they brought the boy out, the guards who had been chosen for their capacity to see what was the one thing they must do, and then do only that, did their looking and said nothing. They crossed the frost-stiff quay to a squat-bellied galley painted the color of unripe pears and filth. A color so disreputable no lord would willingly see it, and so honest no city would fail to let it pass. She had a name, Quiet Mercy, burned into a plank where nobody looked. Davos touched her prow, feeling the grain under paint, the small hum that any good boat makes when she knows she will be asked for something and likes to be asked. She could take them along the coast and tuck herself into inlets where a shepherd might not find her with a year to spend on it. She could carry a boy who was not yet used to being looked at like food and faith. Bear Island first, Davos told the captain. A woman with arms that had more cunning than show. Not straight. You know the literal like you know your own molars. I made them both, she said. If the sea swings a fist, duck when I duck. The oars moved as one body does when it has learned to pull like a thought. The city drifted back, its lamps thinning into stars that had agreed to come closer. The wolf sat with its chin on the rail looking out like a lord counting the fields he does not yet possess. Osha was a shape near the boy, a second shadow. Davos took a place near the stern, where he could put his eyes on both wake and weather, and let the old habit of his mind take him. He thought of the letter that had not yet come, the pink letter, the bastard's letter, the thing men would come to argue about over ale and over graves, weighing ink like lead. Words could move armies. Words could undo the labor of a year with the ease of a knife. But if they were already moving when the letter arrived, if the North had already begun to stand up out of its chairs, to find the old spears under the roofs and the old oaths in the dark corners, the letter would find fewer ears willing to forget themselves. He saw it as he might see weather on the rim of sight and know what sort of cloak to wear. This is how seamen turn into knights, he thought, by naming wind honor and trim justice and calling the course a song. In the second hour, the boy came to him. He did not ask for leave. He stood with his hand on the seat back and looked up at Davos like a small judge. You knew my father, he said. It was not a question, but it asked one anyway. I did, Davos said. Not well. I knew the sort of man he was because I saw the way other men behaved when he was in a room. Men stand up straighter under certain skies. Was he tall? Rickon asked. Davos said, and not as tall as the stories made him. He laughed in a way that made you think it wasn't a thing he did often and that it meant something when he did. He kept his promises as if they were dogs he'd trained and liked to see run. Did he kill men? The boy asked with full child's brutality. He did when duty told him to, and he hated it as if duty were a man he meant to fight later by himself, Davos said. He knew every death was a story finished by a stranger's hand. Rickon accepted that into the place where he kept his serious things. He nodded as if this added a brick to a house inside himself. Can I stand at the front when we get to the islands? He asked then, because children turn from the deep to the shallow like otters and do not apologize for it. You can stand as far forward as the captain allows, Davos said, because the captain was a god and he would not speak for her. Will they like me? Rickon asked, and there it was under the child's wolf and the wolf's child. The thin human fear that all men, even little lords, bring to a new hearth. Some will love you as if they had waited their whole lives for someone to make sense of their faces, Davos said quietly. Some will resent the fact they feel that way. Some will pretend not to so they can keep themselves. Some will smell blood in the water and come for the taste of it. Osha will know the worst before you see it. The wolf will know the worst because that is his work. You will stand up straight and speak little and look men in the eye. That is all. Men will decide. The sea makes its mind and we trim our sails. The boy seemed to accept that too. He put his hand on Shaggy Dog's head and the beast did not deign to notice. Davos watched him walk back to the middle of the boat and sit cross-legged as if to make his body remember an older Earth. Osha watched Davos, and her look said, "If you teach him to be a banner, I will cut you, and if you teach him to be a man, I will owe you something I do not know how to pay." Davos touched the pouch at his neck without thinking. His fingers found only leather and habit. He made a vow then, small and private as a man's breath in winter, to carry this boy like a lantern through dark places until someone else could carry him farther. They ran low and mean along a coast that had forgotten the idea of harvests. The iron at sea level was red where the water licked it. The trees held their boughs like men holding their sides after laughter has turned to cramps. They picked coves that were only coves if you were willing to call a scrape in the stone a place to hide. Twice they pulled off when the boat found the mud's calendar and decided to study it. Once they lay under a cliff while weather argued with itself above, and watched a seal lift its head and consider the fact of men with the generous contempt of a priest. Once, in the morning when the light has to fight more than it would like to, they saw riders on the cliff path and ducked under an overhang that dripped on them like a leaky roof for an hour and left them smelling of old mineral. "Bear Island," the captain said at last, on a noon that had been borrowed from some nicer season. The island rose like a giant's shoulder, rock and pines and the last sort of stubbornness. There were long houses there, and women who did not ask men permission for anything they were strong enough to do with their hands. There were boats pulled up into cradles of timber where they would sleep until someone woke them by name. The air tasted of tar and smoke and the old, clean fishiness of a place where people do not pretend their lives are not work. Tasted like truth. Davos felt his chest gather itself to this and liked himself a little for wanting to be a man who answered such places well. They came in very small, very nothing. That was on purpose. It is unwise to arrive at Bear Island in a manner that suggests you plan to tell them their own business. Women with bows were already watching them because Bear Island is a place where even the birds watching the sea are watched. Davos held his hands where they could be seen and made no show of wealth or want. Osha stood taller, because women from the wrong side of the wall recognize sisters long before they accept the fact. The boy stood. He did not wave. He looked. A girl not much older than he was stepped to the fore on the dock, young and square and fierce as a tallow flame that will not go out even when the lamps around it have surrendered to sense. Her hair was braided like a thing that could be used as rope. A sigil of a flayed man had never darkened these boards, and no man from the Dreadfort had walked here without learning something he did not like. The girl stood like a lady and a soldier and a girl who had scraped her knees often. "Who in all the drowned worlds are you?" she asked, voice sharp enough to fillet a fish in the dark and never nick the bone. "Davos Seaworth," he said. "I come from White Harbor where Wyman Manderley sent me. I bring you Rickon of House Stark, son of Eddard. He has a wolf with him that is too proud to wear a leash and a woman who can count better than most men I have had the misfortune to drink with. We ask leave to stand under your gaze and say a thing that has not been said in front of enough honest people." The girl's eyes went to the wolf and did not blink. She looked at the boy and did not smile because women of Bear Island do not give their smiles away as easily as fish guts. "I am Lyanna Mormont," she said, "Lady of Bear Island. If you have lied your name or his, I will feed your tongues to the ravens for their manners lesson. If you have not, I will hear you in our hall. I will not serve lemon cakes. I do not have lemons. I do not have cakes." Davos bowed, something like relief and amusement arguing inside his chest. "I prefer fish," he said. "Good," the girl answered. "We have fish." Their hall smelled of pine and sweat and leather and the iron of old blood that had been spilled there because some truths cannot be spoken without cutting something. Shields hung as quietly as moons. Spears leaned like men at rest. Women sat with knives in their laps and knitting that looked like armor if you squinted. Men sat with the look of people comfortable with both silence and noise. Davos stood at the line between hearth and house and did what he had been born to do without knowing it. He told the truth in a way that made it want to live. He spoke of the boy, of skagos and unicorns that did not care to be named, of the Magnar whose laughter traveled a long way through him before leaving his mouth, of a fat lord with a kitchen full of plans and a hall full of enemies with smiles on their knives. He did not speak of Stannis until he had to, and when he did he said the name like a man who carries a wound that healed too slow and wrong. He spoke the names Bolton and Fry as if he would like to spit after. He did not embroider. He did not bargain. Osha spoke once to say, "If you serve us your banners, you serve the boy. You do not serve your faces in a mirror. If that is not to your taste, refuse now." The wolf did not speak. He lay with his head on his paws and watched the doorway as if the door were the whole world and he would meet the world there. When Davos finished, the girl who was lady of this hard island looked at the boy as if she were deciding whether he was a fish worth the net or a wave tea. Hat would cost more than it bought, but she was Lyanna Mormont, and the island had taught her to waste neither fish nor wave. She stood up and spoke in a voice that did not yet carry the woman's weight but had the woman's spine. "House Mormont has bled for the Starks since the world was more honest about what it wanted," she said. "We have stood under direwolves while men changed their coats like dogs in summer. We will stand again. If the boy is a Stark, we follow. If he is not, we kill the men who lied to us and go on with our day. I find he smells of wolf." She nodded once to Rickon as if to say, "If you grow into this as you should, I will not spare you because you are a boy. I will watch because you are my lord." A murmur moved like a fox in the hall. Knives were put on tables with decision. Davos listened to the sound of a small island making a large promise and knew the letter that would come could not do as much harm as it might have if not for this. He let himself think for a moment of a boy who would be told later, by men he did not know, that he had done the thing the whole North was waiting for simply by standing and not squinting. Then he let it go. There would be 10 more halls. 20. There would be men who spat and men who smiled and men who asked for something he did not wish to give because the world is full of men who have learned to price their loyalty. He told his feet to get ready for it and his heart to remain slower than it would like. He looked at the boy and saw him put his hand out to a woman with lines by her mouth who might have been a mother if the world had been kinder. She took it and kissed his knuckles like a pledge. Outside, the air was a knife that did not find flesh. The harbor moved in its own small argument, and gulls sang their stupid, honest songs. The captain stood with her arms folded and her patience arranged upon her face the way a good cloak is arranged across a shoulder. Without fuss, but ready to be raised. "One island," she said. 9 more lives worth to go." "More," Davos said. "But the first is always the one that costs the most." "Then you paid," she said. "Sit. I will feed you before this road tries to buy you as well." He sat. He ate. He spoke little. He watched the boy feed the wolf careful bits with the solemn attention of a small priest at a great temple. He heard in his head the scratch and flutter of birds finding their way between the teeth of winter, carrying a boy's name like a coal. In White Harbor, fat men were cutting pies with knives that looked like smiles, and in a tower a maester with a beard like old weather was tying messages with fingers that had forgotten haste. In Deepwood, a man once broken by iron would feel a part of himself straighten. In the mountain hut smoke would shudder as someone stood too fast with hope in him again and knocked his head against the rafters. In the Dreadfort, a man with a bastard smile would wake with the taste of iron on his tongue and think of wolves with distaste and a certain new caution poorer men than he would mistake for a yawn. The sea kept its own counsel. That night, Davos stood on the deck with the cold sting on his cheeks and watched the stars decide which of them wanted to be seen in a world where men were making plans. He put his hand to the empty pouch at his throat. "Luck," he said to the air, like naming an old ship. He thought of the letter that would come. He thought of Jon Snow at the wall, reading words written in a ruinous hand. He thought of what words could do, and what a boy with a wolf might undo, if the North had begun to remember itself before ink tried to tell it what to be. He thought, and then he stopped thinking, and he did the one thing a sailor knows how to do that is of any use to anyone in any world. He kept watch. By morning the sea had settled into that grudging partnership it makes with men who have not given it cause to regret humoring them. Gulls sketched their idiot loops over the swell. Frost clung to the rail like a jealous lover. Davos rubbed it with his sleeve and felt the grain below it. A good, tight old wood that had spent all its seasons listening. They rode the last length in to Deepwood, mott-hauled by a sky the color of pewter. Wind combed thin through the pines so the whole forest whispered one long word. The palisade rose out of the trees with the humility of a practical thing. Hewn timbers shouldered together against older weather and more recent knives. Smoke walked out of the vent holes steadier than it would have in a liar's holdfast. It smelt of pine and old meat and iron. Women stood on the wall walk with bows unstrung but near to hand, because on Bear Island and in the neighbor to it, women did not trust the world to leave them workless. A woman with hair like wet iron and shoulders that had been taught their oaths by 100 bad winters came to the gate when the captain's horn coughed their arrival. She had a child on her hip, calm as a sack of flour. The child chewed a length of leather and looked out like a prince. Men flanked her, clan men of hill and river, wearing their steel like they wore their beards, with no love for ornament and no patience for rust. Alisane Mormont, the woman said. She measured the black wolf first because sense measures the biggest danger first. She measured Osha next because women who carry spears deserve the courtesy of being taken seriously at first glance. She let her eyes rest on the boy as if she were letting a trout rest in her palm to see if it had the weight of a meal. If this is a trick, it's a poor one. The boy smells of pine and dog and the road. A trick would smell cleaner. Davos Seaworth, he said. White Harbor sent me with him. Lionel Mormont said you feed your guests what you feed your family, and you run your spearwives with your own hands. I feed my enemies better than some lords feed their kin, Alisane said, so they can die knowing I had honor. Bring the boy in. Wolves don't wear collars on this ground. I keep prisoners, not pets. The gates lifted on their old ropes with a sound like an old woman standing. Inside, deep wood was a bowl of timber and dark earth and practical care. A bearded man with a nose broken by someone who had done the work properly took their cloaks. Boys ran with pails like a squad of faithful colts. Someone sang under their breath as they wiped a table. The song did not ask permission to be sad. They put Rickon near the hearth long enough to trick the chill out of his bones and the stiffness out of his fingers. Shaggy Dog sprawled with his ribs in the fire's sigh and one green eye open, deciding. Osha stood and warmed her hands without showing it. Alisane's own daughter slid from her hip and touched the boy's sleeve once the way children touch dogs they aren't sure yet will be friends. Rickon looked up and gave her a piece of dried fish as if sharing food were the truest language he knew. She took it solemnly. Children make treaties faster than any lord. Speak, Alisane said. When Davos had eaten enough to convince her, he was not a man with a reason to pretend hunger. Speak, and if you use too many words, I will tell you to use fewer. He told it the way he had told it to Lyanna, the way he had told it to Wyman in the Breath of Kitchens. Skagos, and the Magner's laughter like a drum in a cave. The boat that had more stubborn than canvas. The boy's wolf, the fat lord's kitchen. Wools and Norace and Littles by name, because names are keyholes men put their trust through. A woman at the longboard. A spear wife. Knuckles like last year's turnout of apples. Pounded once and said, the flayed men parade our brothers' skins at Winterfell like banners. I will have their eyes in a bowl before the thaw's done. Her voice made the room pause the way good axes make trees pause. We are not parading, Alisane said. We are knitting. We knit boats, we knit arrows into bundles, we knit the north into one rope. If you knit too fast, the stitches jump. I'll not have that. Lordling. She turned her body so the girl on her hip and the boy with the wolf were both inside her attention. What do you know of us? Rickon made the face of a small wolf trying to count. You fight, he said. You don't bend for southern men. You wrote a letter to the king that said only the Starks are kings. Alisane's mouth permitted itself the barest curve. This one, she said to Davos. He is wild enough to be useful. Good. House Mormont follows the dire wolf. I'll send boats to the stony shore, and men to pull ironborn hooks out of our beaches and sell them back as nails. I'll send a woman who counts faster than any maester to White Harbor with letters. You will go to the clans. They will want to hold your boy up to the moon to see if the light goes through him. They will test his story by how his wolf pisses on their door tree. Let them. A truth does not mind being prodded. They ate her fish and her bread and her silence. In the corner of the hall, a woman whose hair had been shorn for the convenience of a jailer sat with her wrists in irons that were not attached to anything. She watched the fire as if it were a lover who had been kind to her twice and cruel to her once, and she could not decide which to remember. She had the sea in her bones and iron in her mouth. When Davos rose to piss later and found her in the passage where the wind keeps a little of itself, she looked up and said, without the courtesy of introduction, "They told me a wolf pup came to my keep." Davos said. He had sailed enough miles to know truth when it demanded bluntness in its currency. He has a wolf who thinks his own thoughts. The boy thinks them too, sometimes. The woman smiled with half her mouth. "Asha Greyjoy," she said. "Some call me princess. Most call me trouble when I come to dinner. I held this hall for other men once. They took it back. It's the fashion on this coast. We pass our houses between us like cups of wine." "You'll not drink this one," Davos said. "No," Asha said. She looked beyond him as if the stones of the hall were telling her what they remembered. "You carry Stannis Baratheon's old smoke in your clothes, smuggler. You carry the merman's kitchen too. You think you'll stitch the north with a boy and a beast." "I think the north is cloth that remembers which loom it came off," Davos said. "I think there are men with knives who have been squeezing the wrong handles so long their hands forgot what callus is for. I think a Stark at the fire, even a small one, brings the heat back to a room in a way that makes men put their knives down and pick their oaths up." "You talk like a priest at market," Asha said, amused and not. "Be careful where you set your altar. Men bleed on them when you don't mean them to." "I know," he said. "I have bled on altars not of my choosing." "Then get your boy to the mountains," Asha said. "The wolves don't fear winter because they keep it in their beds." The Norreis always owed the Starks 12 honest fights and threw in 2 more for luck. The Littles trust only what fits in their hands. Take him to a weirwood and make him pray out loud where someone who hates the sound of Southerners can hear the old gods in him. Do that, and you'll make more work for the flayed man than he has hands to do it with. "Why tell me?" Davos asked. "You owe me nothing, and the Starks less." She laughed, soft. "Because the boy is a wolf and this world is too full of leashes. And because I have sat in rooms where the wrong banners hang and I know what it does to a woman's stomach. Because I owe Stannis nothing, and I owe your fat lord in White Harbor nothing, and I owe men who cook their enemies nothing. But I owe the North this one decent thing. A chance to get its name back without sewing it from dead skin." She held up her wrists. "And because these bracelets itch." He left her to her wind, thinking of chains that are more comfortable on the wrist than the memory of having worn them is on the mind. In the morning they went. Alysanne gave them oatcakes, and knitted caps that turned boys' hair into peaks, and a woman with a birthmark like a thumbprint on her jaw to guide them up the first bad miles of the mountain road. "Bring them back to me if your boy turns wolf under the moon," she told Osha. "I'll make a story of him that keeps children in their beds when they should be sleeping." "That's my work," Osha said, and they nodded to one another like 2 smiths approving each other's hammers. They left the smell of tar and rope and iron behind and walked into the smell of dry snow and old bark and a whole long past of men being small under trees that had opinions about the weather. The road was not a road but a choice between rocks. Their breath went up and they watched it leave like ungenerous spirits. The woman from the hall said little except to point and to raise her palm when the slope hid the sky in an unfriendly way. Once she stopped and put her hand flat to a boulder as if asking it for gossip. She smiled then at something it told her and pointed right, where a deer path pretended not to be a path. They went right and came to a narrow ledge. The world opened below them, all pines and white and the long blue shadow of a ridge that would make a man feel old if he looked at it too long. "Norre land," she said, and then "little land," and then "wool," as the days unfolded like careful letters. They slept under hemlock boughs where the snow fell through in small secrets, and Osha kept the fire like a miser keeps coin, letting it look poor to strangers and rich to those in the circle. Shaggy Dog hunted things that made no sound dying. Rickon rose with his hair half wild and his eyes green in their brown, and he matched his steps to the wolf's sometimes and to Davos's sometimes and to Osha's most of all. They came to a village that was not a village so much as 3 long low houses married together by smoke. A man with a beard white as the darkest snow and eyebrows that could have sheltered chicks looked at them and spat, and then nodded because he had seen wolves before and still had both arms. "Norei," he said, slapping his chest as if to make sure it knew its own name. "What's the boy's speech?" "Rickon Stark," the boy said, with the haphazard grace of a child who has learned his own name as a stone to throw. "Of Winterfell." The old man's face arranged itself the way a storm arranges itself on a ridge. Slow, serious, full of law. "Weirwood," he said, and jerked his head toward the dark line of trees beyond the houses. They went. The weirwood stood where the ground rose in a small courtesy to it, a hill modest enough to be Northman's. Its face had been cut by a hand that understood sorrow better than joy. The red sap had dried in the old mouths of old leaves. The snow under it was less white than the snow beyond it, as if the tree's dreams were warm enough to spoil it. The old Norei went to one knee with familiarity, the way a man sits down on his hearthstone, and Davos, who had learned the trick of giving other men's gods the posture they demanded, went as well. Osha took the boy and put his hands to the bowl. Shaggy Dog sat with his head low and his ears forward, and the sense in him moving out across the white like a ripple through thin ice. "Say your father's name," Osha said, low.
"Eddard Stark, Rickon Visperet."
His breath made a little cloud that touched the wood and went away. "He was Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North." "Say your brothers," she said. Her voice was very calm, the way you speak to horses. "Robb Stark," the boy said, and there was a catching in him. He worked around it the way a wolf works around a thorn in the paw, patiently with a small growl. "King in the North." "Say the names you know then," she said. "And the ones you don't, the old kings who wore crowns of ice and bones and pine, the brothers who fell and the sisters who stood and the fathers who brought firewood and the mothers who cut it. Say it until the gods hear you and remember you belong to this land." He said them, the ones he knew, tripping sometimes on the mouthfeel of strange old syllables, and then he spilled into words that were not names so much as feelings. Wolf, white, winter, iron, blood, home, and somewhere in there a wind moved through the needles in a way that made sense, and the old Norei made a gruff sound that might have been approval, and Davos felt his back loosen in a way he had not earned. "Good," the old man said after a long time, standing like the tree would be offended if he did it too fast. "You'll not be a phrase puppet, then. You've the look of the stones about the eyes. The North doesn't have so many faces left it can afford to look past one that fits." Food. It was less an offer than a law. They ate oatcakes and smoked mutton. A girl with a snotty nose plucked up courage enough to tug Rickon's sleeve and ask, "Is it true your house has a glass garden?" And the boy nodded as if this were the most important fact of his life and told her about lemon trees that had not eaten men, and the sound of the little glass panes tinkling in wind, and then he fell asleep with his back against the wall and Shaggy Dog for a pillow, and Osha hummed something that had no tune and made more sense than songs. Davos listened to the way the Norei say yes by raising their eyebrows and no by raising their chins, and thought of the sea saying maybe with every wave. 2 days later it was the littles, the old, the little, the green. They tested the boy with hard questions about the old kings and the old woods and who kills deer and who keeps herds. They listened to Osha's answers like they were weighing iron. They listened to Davos like he was a knife they were deciding whether to keep on their table. Then they put 6 spears into his hand as if that could replace 6 promises by men who spoke different words to make the same oath. "They'll come when the white raven tells them the moon has turned twice," the little said. "If you ask sooner, you waste your breath. You can't rush stew or men." The wolves came at the end and asked for nothing. Big bucket scars and old grays and a boy with a bear's tooth strung on a thong. "If the wolf goes to Winterfell, we go," said the biggest, with a smile like a wrecked barn. "We've been bored." He said it like start of a song. Davos learned which men would move their whole houses at a whistle and which would send cousins, which would send a horse and ask for another in return, which would send women with short knives and old laughter. He learned who would come for the boy, and who would come for the memory of the boy's father, and who would come because they were tired of what had been asked of them by men who warmed their hands at other men's fires. And at night, when the tents were only the idea of canvas and their breath went up like thin ghosts, he dreamed once of a chair of stone with a headless man seated in it, and the man's hand reached out to him, and when he reached back he found he was handing over a child made of smoke and ash and wolf hair, and the child looked at him out of sea-green eyes and said, "Keep watch." The way the sea says it, without asking whether you have the strength. He woke with his hand on the empty pouch at his neck, fingers finding only absence, and he said very softly, so no one would think him mad, "I'm keeping." The last river was a black line pulled across the snow with a finger. The last hearth sat where the land folded itself up to sleep. Rooks scampered at the edge of the smoke. There were umber men on the walls, their spears like a second row of teeth. There had been an umber in every story Davos had ever heard about men who were too loud and too honest to keep alive in cities. The Great John was a dangerous joke in White Harbor kitchens and a dangerous example in halls where men thought too much. Davos had drunk to his health without knowing him. He knew the man in front of him by the crow's foot of white hair stuck in his shoulder plates like a trophy and a warning. "Moore's umber," the man said. "Crowfood. The name you call me depends on whether you owe me coin. Who's this pup? Smells like smoke and wet dog." "Rickon Stark," the boy said himself, because he had learned that men took your measure from how you spent your breath when they asked your name. "Of Winterfell. Does he bite?" Crowfood asked Osha with interest. "Good. Come in. We'll look at your teeth by a fire." He jerked his head at Davos. "You keep the leash?" "No," Davos said. "He keeps mine." Crowfood grinned like a knife. Inside, the hall was all smoke and meat and old stories nailed to the beams with rusty nails. There was a skin on the floor that had not been killed by any man who liked to sit indoors, and the benches were scarred by knives and boys and all the things that scar benches in honest places. "The bastard wants my head," Moore's umber said, as if he were telling them the hour. "He can have it when he finds it." The other umber, the one who hoard a name and got named Horsebane for it, "He stands with the flayer because the flayer holds certain heads I'd rather keep in my hall than on my fire." The Great John sits in a fry dungeon eating rat fat and songs. "The world is a bad wife this season." "You'll follow the dire wolf then," Davos said, plain. Crowfood took a knife and carved off a slice of meat and handed it to Shaggy Dog without removing his eyes from the boy. "If he leads like a Stark," he said. "If he heads for Winterfell and not for kitchens where fat men tell lies like their prayers. If he can stand in front of a weirwood and say names without sounding like a maester taking a shit." "We have stood," Davos said. "We have said." "Then I stand," Crowfood said, and shouted a word that meant half the hall stood too, and somewhere outside a boy cackled laughter because when old men shout, something in a boy always believes it is himself being named. Crowfood leaned close then so Rickon had to meet the milky eye and the good eye both. "You take back your father's hall, pup?" he said softly, and it was the softness that made the hair rise along Davos's arms. "You stand under that old dead weirwood on that old round hill, and you don't piss yourself when the snow talks. You do that, and the last hearth packs up house and comes. We'll bring our dogs. The flayer doesn't like dogs. That's nearly reason enough." From the umber hall small, violent courtesies followed them. A boy with a whistle. 6 dogs that thought Shaggy Dog was a god and acted like priests. 3 men who knew the old back roads, the ones that had Anna Frey's blood in them and had never forgiven it. A woman with a jaw like stubborn and a baby at her breast who put the baby in a sling and walked with a spear as if it were a broom and this were her house. Davos accepted them because he had learned that every gift given to a cause is also a debt the cause accrues, and he meant to make good on each. There were hard parts, harder than the ice under the crust that takes a man's ankle when he misjudges a step. At Serwyn, Dog's head men slid out of the treeline after dusk and tried to put a knife into the boy's back the way a man might cut a throat in a stable to quiet a horse. They didn't die easily. Osha killed one with a butt stroke to the temple that made his skull give up its secrets with a small, hard sound. Shaggy Dog tore the second across the chest and shook him like old cloth. The third took Davos across the ribs with a cut that was too honest to call anything but good. Davos caught his wrist and put his knife to work the way a man who has cut ropes in a hurry has learned to move. When it was done, he leaned against the wall for a long breath while his side talked to him like a dockman in a rage. "Too obvious," Osha said, breath low and even, blood bright on her spear haft. "A fry would have wrapped his knives in silk and called it a wedding present. A Bolton's bastard sends boys who think a knife is a time-saving device. She wiped the spear on the dead man's hair, functional as rain. They burned the bodies because the old gods are not prudes and do not mind a man's smoke when it is given with purpose. They watched the smoke carry whispers up to where the sky keeps them and smiled with all the teeth they had left. Rickon did not speak. He pressed his brow into Shaggy Dog's neck until the wolf decided it was enough and shook him off with a soft huff that was almost admonishment. Later, by the fire, the boy put his hand on Davos's side where the cut had been bound by a woman who tied knots like a mother tying a bedtime and said, "Will it hurt more tomorrow?" "It will," Davos said. "Everything worth keeping does." Lady Jonelle Serwyn looked small and sharp as flint when they reached her keep. Her hair was bound with a strap of leather. There were numbers inked on the inside of her wrist in a child's careful hand. She held a ledger in one hand and a knife in the other and gave both equal attention. "My father died for Lord Stark's son in a place where bread lay on the tables and knives hid under it," she said crisply. "I will spend my last barley for a Stark if you spend your first blood for me. I want Boltons hanged in rows like onions. I want fry heads on the parapet so the crows can learn the taste of contempt." "They will learn," Davos said, and thought of the fat lord in White Harbor humming his cooking songs and smiling with too many teeth at men with the wrong badges on their cloaks. "They already have lessons in their bellies." From Serwyn they went south enough to make their breath taste the river, and east enough to make their boots believe in mud again. The tall hearts had been chewed to bone by too many wolves, ironborn, then freemen in bad weather, then duty. A handful of them were left in a hall that smelt of wood that had been wet too often and dried too quickly. A girl there with hair like white straw and a laugh like a nail on stone swore her dead father's oath to the boy and bit her thumb and smeared blood in a line across her own brow and his. "That's for the gods," she said. "The ones that listen are mostly trees. The ones that don't are mostly men." There were refusals, too, because the North is not a song you can only play in one key. A Riswell man. The wrong Riswell, and yet a Riswell is a Riswell, listened very carefully and managed to argue nothing while promising smoke. "My lord stands at Winterfell," he said. "Winterfell is where the North has always come to heal. He has my daughters. I have my pride. You cannot hang pride from a weirwood and ask it questions. It lies to you. But if your boy can find his way to the hall where my lord Sup eats other men's bread and spits it out as if it were ash, and if he manages to stand there longer than a breath, I will consider that pride worth betraying." "We won't knock," Osha said after, when they were in the woods. "We'll let ourselves in through a kitchen. Kitchens see more truth than halls." "Wyman has already laid a table," Davos said with satisfaction. "He has knives in his napkins, and he knows which spoons men favor when they plan to poison a mood." White Harbor changed around them as the boy's name moved through it like a current. You could feel the way a room held its breath when a man with a fish on his sleeve came in and sat without looking around. You could smell the change in the baker's loaves. You could see it. Boys who'd been too quick to laugh too loud were standing straighter and saying less in doorways where Fraze thought they heard everything. Wyman's staff tapped out plans on the flagstones like a blind man learning a new room. 3 taps for gulls, 2 for ravens. 1 for pigeons that nobody suspects. Robert Glover met them in a room that had seen too many confidences to bother dressing itself for this one. He had wrists circled by the memory of chains and the kind of gaze men get when their bodies spent too long being told by other men what to do. He kissed Rickon's knuckles like a soldier kisses a standard, quick and private, and his mouth didn't tremble. "I have men in Barrowton watching to see which way the wind leans against a fry," he said. "I have men with the fisherfolk who will change their boats' names for a day if you tell them what to call them. I have a sister who will brand this wolf on her heart and call it hers if we give her the chance to do it without losing the arm the heart is attached to. I have debts. We'll pay them," Davos said. "You?" Glover asked, one brow up. "You have sea salt. The boy has a name and a beast. The fat man has pastry and patience. If this North is paid, it'll be by 100 men with smaller purses and sharper knives than yours. Then we'll owe them properly," Davos said. "No more bad coin." He dreamed that night of bread and knives and the river that fed the sea that fed the ship that fed the plan. He woke to Wyman Manderley's hand on his shoulder, gentle as a man too big to be gentle can be. "I must show your boy to a certain man whose eyes water when he lies," Wyman murmured. A black brother passing quiet from Eastwatch with a message too loud to be spoken where the wind can carry it. And because Wyman's fat hands could be delicate when they needed to be, they went by corridors that forgot their own corners, to a room so small even Davos could feel larger in it. The black cloak there made the room less warm. The man wore the wall as if it were a ring and he had promised it a finger. "Lord Commander Snow's eyes," Wyman said, which was an odd way to say messenger, and told Davos everything he needed to know about how White Harbor calculated importance. The black brother looked at the boy and blinked as if he had been struck in the face with the sun after a long winter. He put one knee down in the habit of a man who has done it to old gods for years. "My Lord Rickon," he said, with no extra salt and no removed, "I serve your brother at the wall. I carry words in my sleeve that were meant for a man who may not be at the right fire to read them yet. There are dead things walking south of ice. There are live fools walking north of sense. If your name wakes men up under their blankets, I hope they pull their boots on before they run." The boy looked at him as if men in black were trees and the world had always had trees. "Do you know Ghost?" he asked. The brother's mouth stuttered into something like a smile, then shut again on habit. "I know of him," he said. "Tell my brother I'm not a ghost," Rickon said seriously. "Tell him I have a wolf that's not white." "I will," the man said, with the simplicity of an oath that keeps itself. When he was gone, Wyman leaned against the wall because the wall could take it. "If the bastard sends a letter with his pink wax and his packs of lies, Lord Snow will read it with salt on his tongue and the smell of your boy in the room where he reads. He may still do a mad thing because honor makes men do foolish things as well as fine. But he will know the North is not sleeping, and that is worth a pie or two." He sighed. "Speaking of pies, I must host my least favorite dinner. Phrase, one day soon I will eat and not pretend to enjoy it. Today is not that day." He went smiling into his hall like a bear who had decided which of the men teasing him was most worth mauling. Davos took the boy's hand and saw the streaks of soot under the nails and thought, with some gratitude for the ugliness of the world, that grime makes princes look more like men. Then the letter came, because the world loves to test a man's timing. It came to the wall first. That much they learned from the raven the black brother sent back with a hand less steady than it had been. It came to White Harbor after, in a second hand that had made a copy to tuck into safety and a third hand that had decided the first two were cowards. It came wrapped in insult and tied with a little genius for cruelty. It said names as if it were stabbing them. It counted trophies in a voice so pleased with itself Davos could hear the smile. It had the smug, sweaty triumph of a man who had never believed a thing until the sound of himself saying it made it real for him. "Come and see," it said, and Davos could taste blood in the words. He read it with Wyman, in the kitchen where knives were honest and women swore at pastry. Wyman did not sit. He could not have sat without breaking something. His staff made a mark on the floor where it had been tapping for weeks and now found rhythm a stranger. "If a man told me the sun would not rise and then asked me to look out the window in the morning, I would not thank him for his wit," Wyman said, voice very gentle. "This wax smells of fear and piss. Bolton dogs do not like the smell of wolf. We do not let this in the hall," Davos said. "We do not let this into rooms where men are remembering what courage tastes like. We tell Jon Snow his brother breathes. We tell the Mormonts their boats are in the right tide. We tell the wolves there is stew tonight and they will need it. Let the bastard write to rooms where the air is thin. We will fatten our rooms with people, not with paper. You talk sense when I wish to hear vengeance," Wyman murmured, and blew out through pursed lips like a man cooling soup. "Very well. I will give my vengeance a new seat at table. Later." He folded the letter as if it were a napkin and handed it to a scullion. "Put this under a pan. Let it learn its place in a kitchen." He blinked, slow. "And send for Robet. He and I will teach the phrase a song." They taught the phrase a song that night, but it had no words and everyone clapped to it. Men looked at the fat lord and saw a host and looked at the men in gray and saw meat. Davos kept the boy in a room 2 doors down with Osha and 3 men with arms like the uprights of a gallows and a woman with a spoon that had broken men's knuckles when they carried it the wrong way. He could feel the music through the floor. He could smell pepper and pork and the long, slow patience that goes into making a thing worth waiting for. He watched the door and watched the boy watch the door and watched the wolf watch the boy. When it was done the way winter is done, with a silence that isn't empty so much as full of all the sound that just stopped. "Breakfast," Wyman said in the morning, with a voice like a man who had slept sound and dreamed of clean things. "We will send for sailors who are tired of the taste of wharf water. We will send for a shepherd who wants a sheep killed for the honor of it. We will send for every man who can still find his father's name with his tongue and ask him if he wants to remember his grandfather's as well." They made a banner for the boy, and it was the ugliest banner Davos had ever seen and therefore the safest. It was cut from sackcloth. It had a wolf shed drawn in charcoal by a child who had once drawn a very good horse. It would not draw a knife from a spy at first glance. It would not make a fry curious from the back of a hall. It looked like nothing until a boy stood under it, and then it looked like 1,000 things. He took Rickon under it in 20 halls over 20 cold nights. He watched men make decisions the way ice makes decisions, slow but hard once they are made. He watched women choose, and the choices were quicker. He watched boys straighten and girls stop giggling. He watched Shaggy Dog learn court the only way a wolf learns anything, by deciding which pieces of it were worth tolerating. He watched Osha relax enough to tell 2 jokes, and one of them made an old Glover laugh until he cried and had to leave the room to remember how to breathe. He watched robber knights put their theft away and pick their oaths up. He watched knives change their minds about which way they wanted to lie on the table. He watched boots get stacked by doors in pairs, and swords hung on pegs that had been used for coats. He watched the North begin to look like a chest with all the right things back inside it in all their right places, the lid shut against thieves for the first time in too long. And in between all of that, there were small, odd moments that stuck in him like fish bones. In a hut on the stony shore, a woman who had eaten boiled leather in a bad winter took Rickon's hand and put it to her heart and said, "My boy died for a king who was a boy, and I don't hold it against him. Make the next king a man before you send him to tables with knives on them." In a long house above a frozen stream, a man with a missing ear taught Rickon how to spit apple seeds farther than another boy, and the boy won and did not smile, because he was learning. In a yard at Serwyn, Osha showed the boy how to plant his feet and throw a spear into straw so the spear went in deep and stayed there, and when he did it right the second time, Shaggy Dog yawned and looked away as if satisfaction were a cheap habit. Once, in a copse of pines where the sap was running under the bark and you could almost hear it if you pressed your ear to the tree, Davos turned and found the boy had gone. He did not call out because men who have raised sons by accident learn which sounds bring wolves. He waited, and Rickon stepped from between 2 trunks like a word added to the right sentence. And he had a piece of skin in his hand and blood on his sleeve and a look on his face that men are foolish enough to call wild, when it is only the look of a creature that knows how to live. Osha took the sleeve, made a low sound, and taught him how to clean it. They did not speak. Davos stood and watched and remembered Dale's hands when they were small. How boys pick up what fathers mean to keep hidden. The first time the quiet muster put itself into the same field without meaning to, it startled itself. Davos stood on a low hill at the edge of a place where the grass had the sense to keep its head down under snow and saw Mormont men come out of the pines. Women with leather on their arms and iron on their minds, and then a Sarin line sliding like a dark brushstroke along a river's curve, and then the low, wide shapes of umber dogs, tongues arguing with the cold, and after that a knot of Norreys who moved like men walking through their own house. They blinked, collectively, as if each had been told it would stand in a field alone and had been pleasantly surprised to find company. Robert Glover was there, tight mouth and looser eyes. He stumped up the hill and stood beside Davos and did not waste breath on greetings. "If the bastard looks out from Winterfell and sees this," he said, "he will write a new letter to Lord Snow listing parts of his body he intends to send to him by pigeon. And if he sees it and does not believe it, he will tell himself stories until they become the only thing he can hear over the sound of all these boots." His nostrils flared. "He will send eventually. When he sends, we will answer not in halls but in the road." We are not ready, Davos said, honest. We are only ready to be ready. Men who wait to be perfect before they do the right thing never do it, Robet said. But I enjoy a hearth as much as the next coward. Another week. Let me steal you a Riswell from his sneer. Let me tug a Karstark out by his false beard. Let me make a Fry think his bed is a bear trap and his privy is a confession booth. A messenger came then in a foam of breath and mare sweat. He came from the north, from the woods east of the long lake by the smell of him. He had blood on the edge of his ear, and his left boot was tied with a thong torn from a cloak because the lace had snapped. And the thong had a pattern on it that said it had once belonged to a man who thought lions a wise choice for company. Bolton men, he panted. 200 foraging. They put a boy on a stick and called it a warning. The boy was dead already. He'd no name we could find. We gave him one. We buried him under a cairn of 7 stones because no mother should have to dig that long. Davos felt the knife in the words like a skilled hand. He turned to Osha, but she was already looking at the boy. Rickon's face did not change in a way a lesser man would notice. Davos had learned his moods the way a man learns a boat's by the way it sits on a wave. The boy's shoulders moved a little farther apart under his rough shirt. Shaggy Dog stood without obvious cause. The wolf's eyes had that ancient green burn that made hair move on men's arms even in summer. We go, Rickon said. It was the first time he put weight in the word the way a man does when he means to put weight on a spear point. It was not loud. It carried. They went as quietly as 20 men can go through a winter wood when half of them have dogs and none of them have reason to sing. Davos understood the sense in the old way. Keep the boy behind. Keep the wolf where he can be a promise not yet spent. But Osha set them very carefully in the line. Wolf, boy at his shoulder, 2 umber dogs next. Then a Norey with a bow whose string had killed a goose mid-flight last autumn because the man had been bored, and then Davos with his short honest knife and his ribs talking less than they had. She walked at the back. She counted. They found the Bolton men where they always are, where they can do the most harm for the least work. At the edges of something that mattered to someone else. They were cooking meat that did not belong to them in a way that convinced the meat it belonged to anyone with a mouth. They had the ragged look of half-hired, half-bound blades men who had learned to wear other men's colors like they wore hats. A man with a red flayed man tattooed on his forearm made a rude gesture at a woman's name and laughed. He had 3 teeth gold-capped. He would be easy to identify later, and someone's cousin would cry for him whether he deserved it or not. The dogs went first because Crowfoot whistled without moving his lips. They ran like opinions. They brought 2 down in the first howling splash of snow. The Norris arrow shaved a cheekbone and went on to kill a sapling for its sins. Osha did not strike then because she was counting. Men who have never been counted have never been taken seriously and behave accordingly. Shaggy Dog did not spring so much as unfold. He was on the tattooed man before the man had finished a laugh. The sound that came out of him had no place in a hall. It had a place in the old world, where wolves made their business and men with flensing knives were still trying to invent words for what they did. The camp burst into that ugly quick music that fighting makes when it has not had time to dress in careful heroics. Davos moved the way he had moved on decks a lifetime ago when someone shouted rock to starboard and meant it. He slid. He cut. He did the little ugly work that keeps bigger, prettier things from breaking. The tattooed man died slowly. Wolves do not care for clean endings. They care for the living part stopping. It stopped. Someone, one of Crowfoot's, threw snow on the fire because the smell of cooking mingled with blood makes men stupid in the head. 2 ran, and Big Bucket Wool, who had joined them, as if he had been growing from a tree, stepped into one like a house falls on a mouse. The other ran faster. The arrow that took him was the Norris. It went in where a man keeps his breath and came out where a man keeps his secrets. When it was done, Rickon stood with his hand tangled in Shaggy Dog's ruff and his eyes the green of a fresh-cut pine bough. He looked older in the way children sometimes do without anyone's permission. Osha came and put her hand on his shoulder and then pressed her forehead to it for half a heartbeat, as if to greet him as a stranger safely arrived. "Don't make a habit of that voice," she told him softly. "We have too many men already who use it to order life around." "I didn't mean to," he said, and that was very good indeed. Davos let his breath out. He had not known he was holding so much of it. They stacked the dead. They left one alive, trussed and with his own bootlace in his mouth to keep him from spitting. Crowfoot stood over him and recited names as if he were reading them off a list someone had written on the back of his eyelids. Kalin, Hornwood, Tallheart, Umber, Mormont, Glover, Serwyn, Flint, Norrie, Little, Wool, Manderley. And when he had finished he said, very politely, "Carry those back to your bastard like a bundle of sticks. Tell him we have found our axes." The man's eyes were fried egg-wide. He nodded so hard he might have been trying to make his head leap off his neck. They cut him loose because this is the North, and when the North wants a word carried, it does not send a bird if it has a man handy. On the way back to White Harbor, Davos let the lines of the thing, the shape of it, unroll inside him like a sail in a good wind. Islands and halls and huts and paragraphs of oaths, quiet musters and noisier ones. Women who had been quiet too long finding that their throats worked perfectly well. Men who had thought their names were only good for dying discovering they were also suitable for living under. A fat lord building scaffolds under bigger men's plans with flour and patience. A letter burned under a pan because it would stink less there. Snow that fell with the sound of affirmations. The old gods nodding because nodding is what trees do when the wind asks them to. Winter fell, Rickon said, at the rail one dawn when the sea had decided to be a friend if a rough one. The word sounded like a promise told to a sleeping boy at the end of a long story. I dreamt it. The heart tree has eyes. The stones remember feet. The kitchens know a song. We'll wake it without fire, Davos said. We'll wake it with men. The flayed man has my home, the boy said, and there was no break in him then. It was iron finding its own heat. I want it back. You will have it back, Osha said, and she did not say if the boy would hold a sword or a spoon or a wolf when it came. She did not gild. She stitched. They brought him to the wolf's den in White Harbor first because walls remember experience better than skin does. The old fortress crouched like a dog with too many scars to feel the weather. It had seen Manderleys come across the sea pink and hopeful. It had seen Freys pretend to be guests. It had seen a fisher girl bathe her baby in a bucket and then take up a knife and cut a man who had chosen the wrong door. It had a mouthful of stories and teeth to match. In the den's belly, beneath stone that tasted of brine, Wyman showed Davos a map while a baker piped little waves on a pie without looking. We will not give Ramsay Bolton his big battle, he said. If he wants one, let him chase his own tail around his own old stones. We'll bake him smaller battles and feed them to him one by one until he is too full to move and too hungry to rest. Robert Glover will dance around the edges of Barrowton. Alisane will make a mess of the stony shore that cannot be cleaned without losing fingers. The Umbers will laugh and take dogs for walks where dogs like to walk best. In someone else's garden. The clans will appear behind men who thought they knew how to count hills. And us? Davos asked because saying us while the boy was in the room felt right. We will go last, Wyman said, eyes bright over that friendly ruin of a face. We will go like a pie comes to table. Nothing to see, nothing to see, nothing to see. Oh look, the boy, the wolf, 1,000 knives arranged in a pleasing way around them. The Freys did not see it coming because Freys do not see anything until it has already been eaten. The Karstarks saw and squinted, trying to decide whether to sell their squint to a higher bidder. The Riswells saw and told themselves stories about daughters and duties and did not quite believe their own mouths. The Boltons saw, and in Winterfell a man with pink under his smile woke with the taste of iron on his tongue and went out into the yard and killed a dog for not greeting him eagerly enough and went back in and punished his wife with words that would make decent men's teeth ache. Letter, he said then to a clerk with a face like a plate in a poor house. Another letter. Bring me a good piece of pink wax, and then bring me a better dog. Davos saw none of that, save in the shape of what came back to him on men's laces and tongues. He did not need to. He could read the weather on the horizon. He could smell which way vengeance was going to blow. He touched the empty pouch at his neck and thought of bones and boys, and his hand closed on nothing, and that nothing had weight. The boy grew so quickly that even the wolf sometimes paused to look. Not in inches. Those come on slow, grudging, with awkwardness for sauce. He grew in the way a fire goes from a careful flame to heat that makes the air over it tremble. He asked fewer questions, and the ones he asked had teeth in them. He listened to answers. He slept sometimes with his face in Shaggy Dog's ruff, and sometimes with his face to the wall, as if there were words pressed into the stone he hoped to catch with his cheek. He learned the names of men he would order to die one day. Not as a soldier does, in files and ranks, but as a man does who might sit across from a man and need to know what he laughs at when he forgets himself. He learned to accept the way women at Mormont looked at him, which was not the way they looked at a boy to be cooed over, but at a tool to be kept sharp. They called one more thing in that den before the last planning: the old gods. Wyman kept a weirwood in a courtyard that had never asked to be a god's house, and yet had learned to be one. Its face had been carved by a stonemason who had been told not to, and that is sometimes when the truest work is done. Davos, who had knelt on enough gods' floors to have worn out his knees in 3 worlds, went again to one. He put his hand on the boy's head because he had no right to do it and could not bear not to. "Luck," he said, "not to the tree and not to the boy and not to the city and not to himself, but to the old air. Luck." The tree did not answer. The snow made the little sound snow makes when it minds its own business. The boy looked up and said, with the seriousness of a child whose games are heavy as iron, "We'll bring the dogs. We'll bring the dogs," Davos said gravely. "And the pies. And the knives?" Osha said with deep satisfaction, as she oiled her spear and made the light run down it like truth. They broke the north into pieces small enough for men to carry and sent each in its own direction. Runners who knew which bracken-hid men held in it came with their eyes too wide and left with their mouths shut. Boats that had remembered smugglers' tide turned themselves around with joy and glided out as if they had never been moored. Women lifted loaves in one hand and knives in the other and taught their daughters which to hold higher on which days. Boys followed dogs and learned 2 good lessons at once: how to run and when to stop. The machines of a war that is also a homecoming began to work in the quiet, purposeful clink with which all honest work moves. And when, at last, it was time to bring the boy to the place where the North names itself out loud, the broken, beautiful, hated, loved ring of Winterfell, they did not go with horns. They went with snow, and a hill fog that came lower than was polite, and wolf's breath phrasing the air. They went in under the walls in a way that would have made another man brag and made Davos grateful for any god's indifference. They went in with bread in their packs because bread is what strengthens men enough to do the things they will regret later. They went in through a door that had once been a little gate a boy had used to go out and piss and look at frost, and which now had 3 boards nailed to it in such a way that it looked like an old wound closed badly. It opened. Of course it opened. A city is full of men who love to open a door when a man whispers on the other side that a story needs finishing. Inside the yard, the snow lay in the lovely, treacherous calmness of powder on stone. There were men there and dogs, and a sense of a plan that had been laid by a man who likes to lay plans out on a table and move all the little counters and admire his fingers. Davos could smell the instinct of it. He could taste its weakness. Plans that live only on tables forget what floors feel like. They forget what cold does to breath. They forget wolves. Those wolves went through the yard like the truth. Umbers and Mormonts and Serwyn men came behind them, not with that brave, foolish shout men like to make when they want to convince themselves they are not afraid, but with the particular deep sound men make when the thing they have been told to want for 10 winters has finally come into their hands and it is heavier than anyone admitted. Davos did not shout. He kept his knife like an old friend and his breath in decent order and his eyes moving, as boys in gray with pink men's sigils on their arms forgot to remember that a dog can be a wall and a woman can be a storm and a small lord can be a bigger oath than any of them had expected. Ramsay Bolton, that pink-mouthed butcher with a smile like blown skin, never saw the boy. He saw the wolf, perhaps, if the old gods were kind enough to let him die with at least one useful thing in his eyes. He saw men he had thought bought stand up and be better than coin. He saw dogs who had learned to love him less than meat decide they could make a different choice. He saw plans running, all those nice lines crumpling under boot and breath. He saw, and then he stopped seeing, because there comes a point even in the life of a man who thinks he has made a bargain with fear where fear stops bargaining and chooses. The choosing happened in a small place. A courtyard, a stair, kitchen, a snow-filled gap between a curtain wall and a postern. It happened everywhere. The North had a great many small places. The North had been waiting a long time. If this were a song sung in a hall with lemon cakes, they would say the boy stood on a wall and shouted a thing that cracked the sky and the walls fell down like figs and the wolves sat neatly. It was not. There was slop under men's boots and screaming in men's ears and the hot stupid smell of someone's last meal on the stones and the practical business of pushing a man hard enough that he would trip over a body and give you the line you needed to cut a throat without making a meal of it. There were the small brutal majesties of necessary killings and the large, entirely unsung business of not dying at the wrong moment. Davos found himself, as always, where a man of his sort is most useful. In the place where something is about to go wrong because someone dropped something and someone else chose the moment badly to think of his mother. He took the wrist of a man trying to bring a flaying knife down on a Nori's neck and twisted and cut, and the knife clattered, and the Nori, who had been counting out his breath like a miser counts coin, finished his sum, stood and said, "Thank you," with the dignity of a man handing a broom back after borrowing it. He saw Osha on a stair, spear set just so, and men running into the space where death is the natural result of not paying attention. He saw Shaggy Dog on the kitchen threshold, head framed in steam and smoke like a god decided to make himself obvious for a heartbeat. He saw Rickon under the ugly banner, not giving a speech and not playing at kingship, just standing like a stone stands where you put it when you know where you want the house to be. He saw, in a window up and left, a figure move like a negative thought. He saw the pink of the man's mouth. He saw the white of his knife and the black inside his eyes and the sudden, ridiculous understanding that this, after all the long, slow, careful business, would be one of the many ways the story could go wrong hard and fast at the end. He moved. He could not move fast enough. He knew it even as he did it. Bodies were in his way. Stones were in his way. His own years were in his way, stacked like sacks in a hold. The motion changed. It changed the way weather sometimes changes from wolf to lamb in the space between two breaths. The figure in the window jerked and spun like a poorly thrown fish. It hit the sill and fell without elegance. It struck the yard with the wet sound men have been trying not to hear since men started standing upright. And Davos saw, on the highest part of the broken wall where birds once came to say hello, a woman with a bow and a face made for the word enough. Alysanne Mormont lowered the string and nodded once to Osha in the yard, and Osha nodded back because when women who carry the North on their backs make work, they greet each other with their chins. The rest was the hour you spend after a storm, picking up timbers and counting them against a list you wrote while the rain was still dancing. Men dragged men into lines that made sense. Knives went in belts. Breath came back like a poor guest. Someone laughed and then stopped because laughter was too soon to wear. Someone else cried the way men cry when they think the shape they have to make with their faces will break if anyone sees. Dogs worried at old bones. The wolf licked his chops and made no sound at all. In the godswood, where the snow had kept itself whiter out of respect, the weirwood stood with its face remembering every oath. The boy stood before it with his hair in his eyes and the charcoal wolf banner behind him and the winter on his shoulders like a cloak he had not yet quite earned. Men stood around him and women, and robbers who were tired of robbery and cooks who had learned war and children who would be made into the lies of bards one day if they did not look out. They were silent because the North can be noisy but prefers to be quiet when it matters. Rickon put his hand to the tree. The old red tears had frozen into their dark work. His voice came out low in his little chest and went up anyway. "I am Rickon of House Stark," he said. "The North is my home. The North remembers. I remember. It was not a coronation. It was not a trumpet. It was a boy saying what he had learned how to say without being told when to start and when to finish. It was enough. The air changed. The silence opened its hands. Men breathed out. Women took their knife hands off their knife hilts. Davos Seaworth, who had lived long enough to mistrust the moving patterns of the world, put his hand on the empty pouch at his neck and found himself not needing bones to believe. When he lifted his eyes, beyond the boy, beyond the tree, Beyond the old stones and the new blood, the north lay under a sky that had decided, for the moment, to be kind. It would not last. Kind weather never does. There would be ravens and replies and riswells and karstarks choosing in ways that would make men spit or sigh. There would be frays scurrying and eating what they should not. There would be men from the south whose names he'd have to learn so that he could learn to hate them properly. There would be a wall and a brother on it reading letters and thinking mad noble thoughts. There would be winter, but there was also this now A.B. Oi with a wolf in the yard of his father's house, a fat lord in a kitchen smiling at the prospect of feeding his enemies more than they could chew, mountain men who stood with bad teeth and better honor, a woman with a spear beside a woman with a bow, dogs in the yard and dogs inside men's ribs who had finally been taught some new tricks. There was this. It was enough for an hour. Davos could make good work out of an hour. He could make watch out of it. He did.